So hello, I'm Joanna Reeves and I'm Chair and Founder of Conservative Friends of Neurodiversity. And I've got with me today my CFND Friends of Neurodiversity colleague, David Moore. And we also have with us Lisle Smith, who has come up from Dorset to have a chat with us about young people and neurodiversity and the pitfalls, essentially, really. And of course, this conversation was really sparked when there was the article in the Sunday Times a couple of Sundays ago, I think now, with the stories of two teenage boys with neurodiversity conditions who were preyed on by drugs gangs. So it's obviously a massively serious problem. And you immediately said, well, actually, that's something I know quite a bit about. So do you want to tell us about, first of all, the school where you work? And then perhaps we'll explore a bit your experiences.
So I work in a specialist SEN school in Hampshire, and our students all have diagnoses, either autism, ADHD, any of the comorbids.
Comorbids being?
Things like oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, OCD, dyslexia, dyspraxia.
Oppositional conduct disorder, of course, is pretty difficult to deal with, I imagine.
It's fun. You learn. You give people options instead of directions.
Okay, right. No, I'd love to come back to that.
Yeah,
but sorry,
absolutely.
Carry on. I'm digressing.
Many of our students come from relatively difficult backgrounds, which is part of the reason they've ended up with us.
Okay.
All are funded by the local authority, although we're a private establishment, and many of them have criminal backgrounds or police involvement from a very young age.
Okay. Within the family or with the child?
Both. Okay. Within the family, but also actually often our students, because of their behaviours, will end up having some sort of contact with the police.
Right.
So that's how they end up with us, to be honest, a lot of the time.
Okay. And what are the types of criminality that?
Often it can be general ASB. They have a tendency to swear at the police.
Right. Yeah.
To riding motorbikes in the wrong places.
Okay.
It can escalate up to really quite serious crime, but it's relatively unusual. Most of it is low level, repetitive, a lot of sort of absconsion, a lot of and when they abscond, they then meet the wrong people, have the wrong friends, get involved in things like county lines.
Yes.
And that's where their basis is. And of course, being in Dorset and Hampshire, county lines are going further and further southwest. So we're seeing more and more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it fanning out from London?
Yes. Yeah, sort of London. It's coming from London and Reading, and so definitely that direction.
Okay. And what is it, do you think, about well, from the article that sparked this, clearly there was a link between a child having, say, autism or some sort of related neurodiverse condition and being vulnerable to the drugs gangs picking them up. What do you think that is?
I think autism in particular isn't so vulnerable, partly because many autistic people tend to enjoy following rules and they like structure, and therefore they're actually less likely to do things they know are wrong. It's our students who have ADHD that tend to be most vulnerable because they're very impulsive. They tend to have extremely low self-esteem, and that means that they will do pretty much anything for anybody in order for those people to like them, but also for them, they don't think through the consequences. Okay. So they don't look at the impact, they don't look at the victim, they have very little cognitive empathy, so they don't understand the impact on people.
So there are two strands, effectively. One is wanting to please and be liked and have perhaps a community, a group of other young people or slightly older people who feel wanted and liked, connected. And then you've also got hand in hand with that this sense of almost invulnerability. Perhaps that's not quite right. There's not thinking through the consequences and being a little bit
so one of the major factors of ADHD is that you will think, well, it would be a great idea to jump off this wall. Right. The fact that the wall is 30 feet and you'll probably break your feet is irrelevant because you don't think that far. So if you then take that into smoking, taking drugs, drinking alcohol, all they see is the initial fun and acceptance. What they don't look at is what happens next.
Would you say that it's fair to characterize that as being probably most teenagers have that, or a lot of teenagers would have that, but this is an extreme?
It is an extreme. So if you look at the statistics, I think they reckon about somewhere between 2.5 and 5% of the sort of teenage population has ADHD. But if you look at the criminal statistics, probably 25% of those who've been criminalised have ADHD. So I think that's a really good way of measuring it.
Yes.
Is actually, ADHD. It's that extreme.
Yes.
And if you then combine that with, for example, maybe parents who aren't so effective, there's very little. And in fact, one of the issues we have often, particularly even with those in the criminal system, is that the consequences take so long to come round that it no longer has any impact. Because they're ADHD much better with an instant reward or instant consequence than they would be with a court case that goes on for a year and gets adjourned several times, by which time they've forgotten what they did originally.
I bet. So you at your school are busily, trying to follow a curriculum, you're busily teaching them and preparing them with their education and being prepared for life in the same way that everyone needs to be. But at the same time, you're dealing with the consequences.
We do a lot of pre-work, so we do probably considerably more amount of work on what might happen and the what ifs.
So this is before anything happens.
Hopefully. Obviously some don't come to us till after things have happened, but then we help them through that system. They, obviously we know the justice system, we know what they should expect, and so we can kind of help them through that as well.
And are there behavioural difficulties that you have to deal with in the classroom and around the school?
Yes. It's a lot less extreme now than it used to be.
Oh, why?
Interestingly.
Sorry, I think the cat was mewing at
the door. Oh, bless.
I think he's wandered off. Sorry.
So it's a lot less extreme now than it used to be. That's partly because a lot of the students that we used to take now are being maintained in mainstream schools. So we tend to get either the very extreme or the ones with very social services aware parents who are able to push for the diagnosis, push for the change in schooling and everything else.
Oh, I see. So that's what parents want. They want them with you. If they had a choice, they would rather be with you than in a mainstream school, do you think? Does it vary?
For some kids, I think often having a diagnosis and being at a special school is a reason why they can't cope with their child.
Say that again, sorry.
Having a child with a diagnosis.
Yes.
And the fact that their child is poorly behaved and is now at a special school, it's not my fault. My child is very special.
Yeah.
And there is an element of that in our population. But yeah, so we see far less in school than we used to. But I think it just goes in cycles, to be honest.
Right.
The students change, and then in 5 years' time, I'd be saying completely the opposite, and they'll be throwing chairs at me again.
Oh gosh, that's obviously happened to you many times.
Okay, that's fairly normal. Yeah.
And what do you do in that sort of? So I
move.
Right. Quite quickly, I imagine.
or catch it, depending on what sort of chair it is. But yes.
Oh goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever had an experience of this? Because obviously David's, well, you're not back recently out of school, but your education is far fresher in your mind than
well, I wouldn't know what to say about
some
that.
of us.
But I was a
But,
teaching assistant about 2
you?
years ago, in the summer of
Okay.
2021. So a lot of students in my old school, my old grammar school, state grammar school, obviously lost a lot of in-person learning time because of the lockdown. So they asked a lot of former students to come back to help as teaching assistants to get year 7 and 8 back on track. So there were a few students I was with who were SEN and some I worked with some very high functioning autistic students, and I could just see the impeccable standards they had, and also found is they were so harsh on themselves. If they had the one mark below, they would walk out the classroom and like they had failed themselves. And I remember, boosting that self-esteem, saying how incredible this is. This is work I couldn't do.
Right.
7 years older, at least. And now towards more of a question, actually. There's been more of a definitions have changed, and now is ASD spectrum. Yeah. So ADHD, OCD, and Asperger's are all linked into one wheel.
Effectively,
is that a useful redefinition? Would you say?
To be honest, when our kids come into our school, the last thing I do is read their diagnoses, because you get to know someone very quickly. And actually, it doesn't matter if everybody's diagnosed autistic, ADHD, or whatever. Actually, every single one of them is completely and utterly different. They might have the same diagnosis.
So truly, it is a spectrum, such an
it's so
scale.
Wide. Yeah, it is so wide that I think the diagnosis is almost becoming irrelevant. Actually, what we need is teachers who are able to just teach the student rather than teach the diagnosis. I think is the best way to put it, because it's so wide. And in my classroom, I'll have eight students. I'll be teaching computer science. I've got 8 students. I'll have one with PDA, one with OCD, one with autism, one couple with ADHD pacing at the back of the classroom, and you have to teach to the student. And the really interesting thing, when we teach teachers don't have to be taught how to teach SEN students.
Go on.
Which means that they don't do it. So most of our mainstream teachers spend little or no time with SEN students, other than in a mainstream setting.
Okay.
So they are never taught to deal with that. So there's a lot of people I know at the moment who are unqualified teachers who are going through to become qualified teachers.
Right.
Now, if you work in a mainstream school, you can do it in 12 weeks, produce a portfolio and go, yeah, there you go. If you work in an SEN school, you have to do 30 days in a mainstream school first.
Okay.
But if you're in a mainstream school, you don't have to do 30 days in SEN.
That's really interesting.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
And yet our diagnosis is becoming more and more wide and more varied.
Yes.
And there's no requirement.
Yes. And of course, every mainstream teacher is going to come up against it. I mean, I firmly believe that every family in the country has got an individual, at least one, who has some sort of neurodiversity. Yeah. When I did my teacher training, I did a PGCE in the 90s and taught French and German. And I was very well trained. So it was a great, I was on a great course and came out feeling very, very well prepared and well trained. But in those days, there was differentiation. So you would be expected to teach a lesson to all of the ability levels. I was very well trained to do that. Neurodiversity was just not a thing. No. There was a slight understanding of dyslexia. Yeah. And that was it. And we weren't taught anything about dyslexia. It was just, well, they'll sort of work it all out. Yeah. Which is, so it's a brilliant thing that there's more understanding now and more advocacy.
But I still don't think they're teaching teachers that.
Right.
That's what we see when we get particularly new teachers coming through to us. Yeah. Is actually that is not part of what they're taught.
And do they tend to come from other schools? So, say a mainstream school, or do you get newly qualified teachers?
We get NQTs. Yeah, we get NQTs coming through who honestly walk through the door and they're like that. Oh. And they either stay or leave fairly quickly.
Right. And I imagine the ones that stay are brilliant.
Yes, yeah,
because
absolutely. Because they
thoroughly-
found their thing.
Yes.
But they all say they didn't do this in their 3 years training or
No.
whatever. They just didn't come across it.
So that's a huge thing then, that teacher training, whether it's a PGCE or a teaching degree, and that's a huge thing.
And it's quite serious. And my issue with it is that all of the students I teach, bar very few, probably a very small bit, are perfectly capable of getting exactly the same GCSEs as any mainstream student.
Right.
Now, they won't, because they've had huge interruptions to their education for whatever reason. And they haven't been taught properly until they get to us. And sometimes we don't get them until year 10.
Wow, okay.
Sometimes not even till year 11. We start at sort of year 4, but quite often we don't get them till later. The ones we have from year 4 all the way up do really well.
Right.
And will come out with normal GCSEs. But if we don't pick them up till sort of year 7, 8, 9, they don't have it because they're so far behind. And one of the biggest issues, going back to the original topic about criminality, is that if you haven't got those qualifications, you can't get on the apprenticeships, because you need a minimum of 5 GCSEs these days to get on an apprenticeship or to get into a college course. And that low level of education is a prime indicator, along with their diagnoses and their background, for them becoming somewhere, ending up in that criminal justice system.
Yes, that's something that I've just had a feeling about, is that catch a neurodiversity early, do whatever tweaking you need, because in some cases it's actually very slight. It might just be a yellow film over the top of what you're reading, like the ear defenders. It's something we were talking to Andrew Buff about, wasn't it? It's very, very simple things for quite a lot of
Or just
them.
being allowed to walk at the back of the classroom because you can't sit still for 45 minutes during a whole lesson.
Right. And then if you pick it up early and there's understanding, away you go. If it's not picked up, and then they can't understand, they know they're not stupid, and they can't understand why they're not learning.
No.
This is a real soapbox thing for me.
And then they get frustrated.
Then
they get suspended.
Yes.
And then that whole cycle, so school becomes an awful place to be.
Yes.
And that whole cycle starts.
And then you're sort of almost branded one of the bad kids.
Yep.
And you're not, it's just because you
got the diagnosis.
And
actually...
or you don't have a diagnosis.
Or you don't have a diagnosis.
And
we're now getting more and more girls. Still a huge amount less than we do boys, because girls tend not to be diagnosed.
And is that because girls are copers and hide it?
Yeah, girls are very good maskers.
Yeah.
But also so if you take autism as an example, one of the sort of classic signifiers for autism is you become hyper-focused on something.
Okay.
Girls do that. They get obsessed with horses or Barbies or
I was
star.
horses.
Yeah, there you go. So it doesn't get picked up. Whereas boys tend to be less like that. So when they do start to become hyper-focused, people notice. So it's part of female nature that actually you may not get picked up or diagnosed because of the way you are.
Yeah.
Because you're a woman.
And so is that why people tend to think that girls will get dyspraxia or dyslexia worse? But it's only because the ones that get noticed have it worse, because otherwise they wouldn't be noticed.
No, exactly.
They wouldn't have been noticed otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Yeah, I do, because the girls we do get tend to be at the fairly extreme end.
Okay.
Because the other girls are so good at masking. I mean, apart from anything else, other girls are hideous creatures, and therefore girls learn to hide things very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
you don't want to make yourself vulnerable. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So girls do tend to be sort of socially much more aware, I think.
We get nicer, don't we, as we grow up?
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes.
Talking of diagnosis,
yeah.
I think many feel like if they get diagnosed, they will be discriminated against or prejudiced. In other words, by employers or by certain roles that say if you have ADHD, you cannot do this role. So, for example, I was actually met my GP today, to go through my medical forms. And one of the barring entries to the forces is unless in extreme / rare case-by-case circumstances, which we're trying to improve actually through policy, is ADHD and OCD, etc. That is a bar.
Yeah.
Now, in 2009, I was referred to be potentially diagnosed with ADHD. I was never diagnosed because my parents said no.
Yeah.
But my teachers referred that. Now, that's not obviously an official diagnosis, but the point being is, if I was diagnosed, then I wouldn't be able to continue with that application.
Yeah.
And I think, would you say, at the end of the day, there's so many people that are on the spectrum, and this is a label diagnosis, and you just said yourself, you don't look at their diagnosis, you look at who they are. Do you think we need to focus on that and less on the kind of labels of the diagnosis?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the need to be diagnosed has been very much led by how to put this tactfully, the need for finances from the families. Because once you get the diagnosis, you can claim this, you can claim this, you can claim this.
Right. Yeah.
For example, students with autism, their parents get a Motability car. Along with any other sort of disability allowances that they might get. So there is a really big, a lot of certainly the parents we come into contact with, a lot of them, we get sent their PIP forms to fill out.
I see.
And it's well, he's got this diagnosis, he's got this, and then they're fighting for the next diagnosis. And they want the diagnoses because that suits their lifestyle.
Right. Yes.
And I think that's where you see the difference between child A, who has autism, ADHD, and does very well in mainstream school and goes on and flourishes, and those that probably end up with us and then have a more difficult pathway because they're coming from an entirely different sort of worldview.
Right.
As to, yes, I can cope, or no, actually, I need to get everything that I can get, otherwise I won't cope.
Interesting. So things like, for instance, the Motability car, not every autistic child is going to require that according to their actual needs.
No, most don't.
Yeah, so that's what I would have thought. I was thinking that.
Yeah.
Is there room for a sort of shake up with that, do you think?
I think there has to be. I think people have become very reliant on this. Well, my daughter behaves like that because of, my son behaves like that because of. And actually, but they're almost used as excuses.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a kind of need for them to be not excuses, but just, this is what that person's got, so they're going to get on with it and do it their way, rather than, well, I've got that, so I can't do that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that's where it is that me.
And then at the same time, you've got people who, so the people who don't want the diagnosis, for whatever reason, as Dave was saying. Sorry.
But I think that comes when you're older and you realise the kind of impact that that's potentially going to have on you.
The fear of the state, possibly. I think particularly for Conservatives, that's what we, very conscious of, the state being too big.
So my youngest daughter is technically physically disabled. She was born without a right hand. She's really not. She plays the violin, rides a horse, does anything else. So she's really not. Drives a car. But when she was very young and first started school, the school desperately tried to pressure me into getting her an ECHP.
Right.
Because they wanted the money so they could get a one-to-one TA.
Okay.
Who wouldn't have been a one-to-one TA because she never needed her.
Of course, and that person would have just ended up being a teaching assistant.
Yeah, absolutely.
An extra
but they honestly, and I had to properly put my foot down and say, no, absolutely not.
Yeah. Because you just don't know once you're in a system and you've got a label.
Well, yeah, but apart from that, it was a real case of actually, if I allow someone to do everything for her, then she'll never do anything for herself.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it was because, and I think there has to be an element of that. I mean, I look at myself when I was at school, and I would say I've almost definitely got ADHD, probably some autism in me. Had I been diagnosed, what wouldn't I have done? That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah.
And that's how I quite often see a lot of our kids at school is like mum and dad, oh no, they can't do that because and I'm like, no, that's why they should do that.
Yes.
You know, if they fail at it, that's fine.
Yes.
You know, because that's part of learning. Learning to take those risks. It's like if you never let a child cross a road on its own, then it will never be able to cross that road on its own.
Yes.
And it's exactly the same theory. So I do believe that we have to let children take risks.
And that
means sending them down to the local park where the local county lines guy is, and do you know what? They'll come back with terrifying stories, but they'll learn.
Well, I used to, as a child, there was a slide at the local park, which was just like you'd climb up really high and you'd go down the slide.
Those metal ones.
Yeah.
Did you put butter on it?
Oh, no,
we used to put butter on ours.
Oh, you were wild. So it was like on concrete. So if you fell off, you'd have concussion or break your wrist.
Yeah, absolutely. We have become very kind of almost. I'm
not saying that's right, by the way.
Risk
averse, and we spend our lives giving reasons why somebody does something, making excuses.
We want to sort of support and be kind in a way that it still propels people forwards.
Yes.
Without holding them back. And yet at the same time, as you say, accepting failure's fine. Just
absolutely. You know, it's just not your thing. Don't worry about it.
You're not going to succeed at everything. So
no, absolutely.
And so, as we're obviously conservative friends of neurodiversity, do you look at? Do you have a message for the government that? What's your manifesto? Stop diagnosing everyone. There we go. And that's actually a very conservative message. I mean, I'm getting for more, but that in itself is a very conservative message.
It is because it's about opportunity, and it's about actually, regardless of your diagnosis and regardless of where you come from, there is always an opportunity to change that.
Yes.
And it's not something that people should be relying on.
Or aspiring to from the sound.
Or aspiring to, absolutely. You know, it's how many diagnoses can I get? Actually, your diagnosis is irrelevant because the more people that have it, the more irrelevant it becomes anyway.
Oh, that's true.
Because it then becomes not neurodiverse, does it? It becomes completely normal.
Becomes normal.
Yeah. So, there is a bit of an aspiration, I think, at the moment to have a diagnosis.
The main message is stop diagnosing everyone. And, and for schools,
teach your teachers. Teach your teachers.
Yeah. Okay. So stop diagnosing everyone, and teacher training. Teach teachers to be able to teach the neurodiverse, or to understand at the very least.
To be able to teach, because it doesn't take that much of an adjustment most of the time.
Yeah.
It really doesn't.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, I think those are two really fantastic messages.
Absolutely.
So let's.
There we go.
I think that's a brilliant place to start. Thanks so much, Lisle.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Good.